All right, welcome back everyone to page 3 of the Unit 5 final exam review. This page is all about the sum and difference formulas again, so having that formula sheet out is going to help you. If I ask you to find the exact value of something that's not on the unit circle, you can use the sum and difference formulas to do that. So, for example, cosine of 375. 375 is not something we look at on the unit circle. However, I can look at things on the unit circle that add up to 375. One example would be 330 degrees and 45 degrees. 330 and 45 degrees are both on the unit circle. Added together gives you 375. So now if we use our sum and difference formula, cosine of a plus b is going to be cosine of 330, cosine of 45. So we do cosine of both, we switch the sign, and then we do sine of both. Okay, and then we just evaluate using our unit circle. So the cosine at 330 degrees is root 3 over 2. The cosine at 45 is root 2 over 2. The sine at 330 is negative 1/2. The sine at 45 is root 2 over 2. And finally, we simplify. Okay, this first piece gives us the square root of 6 over 4. They're both going to give us over 4. A negative times a negative is positive. 1 times root 2. And there's our final answer. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing here for sine of 5 pi over 12. 5 pi over 12 is not on the unit circle. Nothing over 12 is. So I have to think in terms of over 3, over 4, over 6, over 2, things that are on the unit circle. How can I get that to break up to something that is on the unit circle? So 5 out of 12 can be broken up into 3 out of 12 and 2 out of 12. So 3 pi over 12, 2 pi over 12. The reason I picked those is because 3 over 12, 2 over 12, they simplify to things on the unit circle. So 3 over 12 is really pi over 4, and this is pi over 6. So those are values that are on the unit circle, and then I can use my sum and difference formula for sine to go from there. So for sine, we take sine of the first one, cosine of the second one, keep the sign the same, then we're going to do cosine of the first, sine of the second. Okay, sine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. Cosine of pi over 6 is root 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 4, root 2 over 2. Sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Okay, both those fractions become over 4. This is going to give me root 6 plus root 2. And there's our final answer. Okay. Tangent of 165. So for tangent, I'm going to look at what adds up to 165. I might pick 135 plus 30. Again, there are multiple different ways you can add or subtract to get 165. As long as they're unit circle values, that's fine. You'll still get the same answer. Okay, for our sum and difference formula for tangent, we're going to start with tangent of the first one plus tangent of the second one all over 1 minus tangent of the first one times tangent of the second one. Okay, so our tangent at 135 is -1. Our tangent at 30 degrees is 1 over root 3. So that gives me 1 minus -1 times 1 over root 3. Which just changes to a plus. Okay, and that's perfectly fine to have it written like that. Other ways this could also be written. You might see the answer like this, or like this, okay? But this is a perfectly acceptable answer. All right, number 17 is actually kind of going backwards of what we just did. If you notice that you have tangent of something plus tangent of something, 1 minus tangent times tangent, this is actually the sum and difference of tangent, but it already gives you what those two values are. So this started from tangent of pi over 12 plus pi over 6. Okay, so in order to add those together, I need to have common denominators. So I'm going to need to multiply this by 2. Oops, I forgot my pi there. Combining again, I get tangent of 3 pi over 12. Tangent of pi over 4. And that just gives me 1. Okay. All right, number 18 and 19 are same idea. You're just working backwards. Okay, notice that it's sine times cosine, which tells me that it was a sum and difference of sine. Since it's the same sign for this, that means it was 95 plus 55, okay, which is the sine of 150, and the sine of 150 degrees is 1/2. All right, number 19, cosine tells me that this was a sum and difference of cosine, and that means the sign is opposite. So 160 minus 40, which is the cosine of 120 degrees, and the cosine of 120 degrees is -1/2. Okay. All right, number 20. In order to look at number 20, we actually need to draw a couple pictures here, just like we did on number 1. So our first piece is talking about the sine of u. So I'm going to draw one picture for u, and then the second piece is talking about the cosine of v. So I'm going to draw a second picture for v. So sine of u is 12 over 13. That tells me sine is positive, but it tells me it wants to be in quadrant 2. Okay, so with sine being positive, I had two options, either quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, but it specifically said it wanted it in quadrant 2. So sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So I'm going to have to do some Pythagorean theorem here to find the missing side, and I end up getting 5. However, this is going to be a negative 5 since it's in quadrant 2. All right, my second piece here, for my second picture, I'm going to look at V, the cosine of V. And then it also tells me it wants this in quadrant 3. All right, so cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and the 3 is going to be negative because in quadrant 3, that piece is negative. Our hypotenuse is always positive. Doing Pythagorean theorem would give me a length of 4 here, but again, since that's quadrant 3, that's going to be a negative 4. Okay, so cosine of u minus v, our formula tells us that is cosine of u, cosine of v, plus sine of u, sine of v. So, oops, I wrote thetas here when this should be u, and this should be v. Okay, so for u, I'm looking at this triangle. The cosine there is negative 5 over 13. The sine is 12 over 13. Okay, and for v, I'm looking over here. The cosine is negative 3 over 5. The sine is negative 4 over 5. And then from there, I'm just going to simplify. Okay, so I end up getting negative 15 over 65. And I get negative 48 over 65. Combining to give me a negative, oops, this was positive, excuse me, negative 33 over 65. Okay. All right, the last two questions on this page say to simplify the expression, still using the sum and difference formula. So in this case, I have cosine. So I'm going to do cosine x, cosine negative pi. Change the sign. Oops, I'm just going to leave that as pi. Excuse me. Change the sign, sine of x and sine of pi. Now I can't simplify anything with x, but I can with pi. Okay, cosine of pi is negative 1. The sine of pi is 0. So this gives me a negative cosine x. Anything times 0 is just 0. So that's all I'm left with is negative cosine x. All right, and then number 21. We have sine of pi over 2. Cosine x, keep the sign the same, cosine pi over 2, and sine of x. I'm going to look at what I can actually simplify, which is sine of pi over 2. That is just 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. 1 times cosine is just cosine x. Plus 0. I don't need to write that. This whole thing becomes 0. Okay, that's the end of this page. Go ahead and start the next video for the final page.